Montana Territory, June 1877, the first time Quentin Vaughn saw her. She was barefoot in the mud outside the general store in Miles City, clutching the hand of a little girl and shielding a boy behind her skirt, as if she could block out the entire world. Quentin stepped down from his horse, boots landing heavy in the dust, and paused. He did not know her name yet, but he knew trouble when he saw it, and she looked like she had not had a kind day in years. She was young, maybe 22, with a sharpness in her eyes that had not dulled from crying. Her dress was torn at the hem, her shoulders too thin, but she stood solid as a fence post beside those two children. The girl, maybe 6, stared up at him with a guarded frown. The boy, a little younger, peeked out from behind the woman's side, thumb in his mouth. The store owner, a squat man with a red face, slammed the door behind him and sneered. "I said no credit, and I meant it. You got nothing to trade, you get nothing." The woman did not flinch. "Then we will go hungry. Again." Quentin stepped forward without thinking. "That how you talk to mothers out here now, Frank?" Frank grunted and spat into the dirt. "She ain't from here. Showed up yesterday with 2 kids and a story nobody asked for." Quentin looked at her. "Is that true?" The woman lifted her chin. "My name is Vela Lorne. These are my children, Paulie and Petal. My husband died in Kansas last winter. The man I followed after that left us outside of town with a broken cart and no food. I am not asking for charity. I will work." Quentin did not move for a long moment. Then he took off his hat and knelt down in front of the girl. "What's your name, sweetheart?" She blinked. "Petal." "That's a pretty name. You hungry?" She nodded. He stood and looked at Vela. "You have nothing." She squared her shoulders. "That is correct." He met her eyes. "And I do not want much." Her brow furrowed. "I got land, a lot of it, south of here near the Tongue River. A cabin that needs tending, horses that need feeding, a roof with holes and a stove that works if you know how to coax it. I live there alone." She said nothing. "I do not need a wife for show," he added quietly. "But I need someone steady, and those kids, they need more than what this town will offer." "You are offering help," she said slowly. "But why offer more?" He glanced at the children. "Because I do not believe in watching people suffer when I got the means to stop it, and because I think you are stronger than most. You are still standing." She looked down at the dust, lips pressed tight. "You are offering your land," he nodded, "and my last name. If you want it. You do not even know me." "I know enough." Petal tugged at her mother's hand. "I want to go with him." Paulie just looked up, wide-eyed and quiet. Vela picked him up and held him tight to her chest. Then, after a long silence, she looked at Quentin. "I do not trust anyone." "Not yet. You do not have to," he answered. "Not today." She nodded. "Then take us with you." The ride south took most of the day. Vela sat behind Quentin on his horse, arms tight around her children, riding double on the second mule he had led into town just in case. The prairie rolled out like a sea of gold and green, dotted with cottonwoods and the occasional hawk overhead. The wind was dry and warm. Quentin's land sat nestled along a bend in the river. The cabin was small but standing, with a stone chimney and a swing on the porch that creaked softly in the breeze. A corral held 2 horses and a shaggy mule, and a small barn leaned slightly to one side like it might sigh and fall over someday. He helped her down from the horse and led the children inside. The place smelled of cedar and smoke. It was plain but clean. Vela set down her bag, threadbare and light, and looked around. "You live here alone?" "Have for the last 6 years." "Why?" He shrugged. "Never found a reason not to." She glanced at him. "And now," he met her eyes, "maybe I just did." That night she cooked beans and cornbread on the stove while Petal swept the floor and Paulie curled up in a blanket by the fire. Quentin repaired the latch on the door and brought in water from the well. He did not ask her about Kansas. He did not ask what the man had done or how long she had been walking. She looked at him across the table after the children fell asleep. "You meant what you said, about your land. And your name." "I do not offer things I do not mean," she nodded. "Then I think I would like to earn both, if you will let me." He reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers, rough hand to rough hand. "Vela Vaughn," he said softly. "Has a nice sound to it, does it not?" She smiled for the first time since he met her. "Yes," she said, "it does." The hens had stopped laying again. Quentin crouched by the coop before sunrise, brushing straw aside with a calloused hand, one egg small, freckled, still warm. He slipped it into his pocket and stood, back stiff from the cold that hadn't yet lifted. Smoke curled thin from the chimney. Inside, the stove ticked faintly and Vela was bent over the table, stitching a tear in Petal's dress by lamplight. Her hair was pinned up, a few strands loose at the nape of her neck, catching gold in the rising light. "You always mend before dawn?" Quentin asked, stepping in and latching the door behind him. She didn't look up. "Only when there's more holes than thread. If I wait too long, it'll unravel beyond saving." He set the egg beside her needle tin. "One today. That's one more than yesterday." Quentin pulled off his coat and hung it by the door. "I'll head out soon. The north fence is leaning." Elk must have run through again. Vela tied off her stitch and bit the thread clean. "I can bring the children to the river after breakfast. They haven't had a full wash since we arrived." He nodded. "The current's steady but not deep. If you walk west along the bank, there's a little cove with stones worn smooth. That's where I go." She folded the dress and set it aside. "Will the horses spook if we pass the corral?" "Not with you. They already trust you more than me." Vela glanced toward the back room where Petal and Polly still slept. "They're not used to quiet. It unsettles them." "You think they'll ever settle into it?" She met his gaze evenly. "They might. If it keeps lasting." It was afternoon when he returned, shirt damp with sweat and a long rip across his sleeve from barbed wire. He found Vela kneeling in the garden bed, hands buried in the soft loam, dirt smudged across her cheek. Petal sat nearby, sorting pebbles by color. Polly slept in the shade of the porch, his head on a folded flour sack. "I patched the fence," Quentin said, stepping over the row of beans she'd planted. "It won't hold for long unless I cut new posts." Vela wiped her hands on her skirt. "I can help split them." "I've handled an axe before." He studied her. "You sure?" "I wouldn't offer if I wasn't." He crouched beside her. "You always work this hard." She brushed soil from her fingers. "Idle hands are dangerous. I've learned that." He didn't ask who taught her. Instead, he nodded toward her garden rows. "You've got a good eye for spacing." "I trained under a midwife once. She kept her healing herbs in perfect lines, said the body listens better when order's kept." Quentin sat back on his heels. "You still remember all that?" "Most. Some of it I only recall when I need to. Like how to pull nettle sting with plantain, or how to stop bleeding with yarrow." He tilted his head. "You planning on teaching Petal, if she wants to learn? She's more curious than cautious, though." They worked together in silence for a time, pulling weeds and patting down earth. When the sun dipped lower, Quentin fetched a pail and washed at the pump, the cold water shocking enough to make him hiss. Vela passed him a rag without comment. Later, while he shelled beans by the door, she sat nearby combing tangles from Petal's hair. Polly stacked bits of firewood, making towers that fell and scattered. The air smelled of cut grass and smoke. "Quentin," Vela said, not looking up from her task, "do you ever get tired of the quiet?" He ran a thumb along the edge of a cracked bean. "Not tired. Just aware of it." "What does that mean?" "It means I notice who's in it with me." She paused, fingers still. "And who's in it now?" He looked at her, the porch light catching in his eyes. "You, them. That makes the quiet good." She didn't answer, but her hands moved more gently after that. When the children were tucked in and the house had gone still, Vela stepped out onto the porch. Quentin was there already, one boot propped on the rail, watching stars appear. She leaned against the post. Paulie asked if we'd stay here, for good. What did you tell him? That I'd like to. If we're welcome. You're more than welcome. She looked up at the sky, the hush between them not heavy but full. Then, quietly, you don't ask questions. Quentin turned his head. I figure people tell what they need to when they're ready. I'm not sure I'll ever be ready. That's fine. I don't need the past, I just need the now. She looked at him, eyes steady. And the now's enough for you, he nodded once. Always has been, but it's better with you in it. She stepped closer, close enough that the scent of lavender soap reached him faintly from the wash earlier that day. Then I'll stay in it, she said. Quentin reached for her hand, and this time she let him hold it. By late July, the river had thinned to a slow ribbon, warm and shallow where it curved behind the cottonwoods. Vela stood knee-deep in it, her skirt hitched to her thighs, washing linens against a flat stone. Her arms were tanned from the sun, a few freckles beginning to show where her sleeves didn't reach. The air buzzed with flies and the low drone of bees from the thistle patch along the bank. Petal gathered reeds upstream, chasing minnows with the hem of her dress while Paulie sat cross-legged on the shore, sorting through shells and tossing the broken ones back. From the ridge above, Quentin watched the scene as he led a mule loaded with fence rails. He didn't call out, just kept walking until he reached the edge of the field, where the wind stirred the grass in slow waves. He set to work with steady rhythm, the sound of the post-hole digger carrying faintly on the breeze. That evening, Vela found him behind the barn, hammer in hand, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt. She crossed the yard holding 2 tin cups of water, both hands wrapped around them to keep from spilling. She passed him one without a word. He drank, then wiped his mouth on his sleeve. That's the last corner post, should hold through the frost. She drank too, watching the horizon where the sun bled orange behind the butt. You work like a man who's making up for lost time. He handed her the empty cup. Maybe I am. She set both cups on the ground. You're quiet when you're thinking, but not like someone keeping secrets, more like someone listening for something. Quentin looked at her, one brow raised. Listening for what? I don't know, she said softly. Maybe the part of yourself you don't speak out loud. He leaned against the fence rail, arms folded. I used to talk more when my brother was alive. We ran cattle together before the fever took him. Vela didn't press. She waited, letting the stillness stretch long between them. He was louder, Quentin said at last. Talked circles around me. When he died, it felt like the world got too big. I stopped filling it with noise. She stepped closer. And now he met her gaze. Now it doesn't feel so empty. Vela looked away, blinking against something sharp at the corner of her eye. Paulie started asking about school books, said he wants to learn to read properly. Quentin nodded. There's a woman in town, Mrs. Elwell. She takes in students once the harvest's in. I can ride in and ask. I'd like that, she said. He's quick, even if he's quiet. He gets that from you. She smiled faintly. I was loud once. Long time ago. Quentin reached out, brushing a strand of damp hair from her cheek, his fingers lingering just a breath longer than they needed to. You don't have to be loud for me to hear you, he said. Vela didn't move. You always speak like something's earned, not given. That's because it should be. They stood like that until the light slipped away, the first stars blinking out above the ridge. That night, after the children were asleep, she sat on the porch mending a sock by lantern light. Quentin joined her, carrying 2 mugs of chicory brew. He handed one to her and sat beside her on the bench, their shoulders not quite touching. You ever think about tomorrow? She asked, eyes still on her stitching, Sometimes. What does it look like? He thought a moment. Wood stacked high enough to last the winter, a roof that doesn't leak, you and the children warm. Maybe chickens that lay more than once a week. She gave a quiet laugh under her breath. That's not dreaming, that's surviving. I don't know how to dream big, but I know how to build small things that last. She folded the sock and set it aside. That's more than most ever learn. He turned toward her. What about you? What does tomorrow look like? She hesitated. Safe. That's all I've ever wanted. A place where I don't have to watch the door every time the wind shifts. A place where no one leaves unless they mean to. Quentin's voice was low. You have that here. She looked at him then, full and open. Do I? You do. Vaylor reached for his hand, not tentative anymore. Then I think I'm ready. For what? For all of it, she said. The land, your name. Whatever comes after. He didn't speak. He just leaned forward and kissed her, slow and steady, like a man who knew exactly what he was offering and exactly whom he was offering it to. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his. You didn't ask anything of me. Not even now. I told you from the start, he murmured. You had nothing, I didn't want much, she smiled. But I've got more now. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. And so do I. By late August, the cottonwoods had turned pale and dry, their leaves clicking together like bones in the wind. The heat had shifted to something heavier, as if the land were bracing for the cold it knew would follow. Quentin returned from town with a sack of flour slung over his shoulder and his eyes drawn tight. He found Vela at the root cellar, sorting onions and tying them in long braids. Petal and Polly were out of sight, likely with the goats he'd bartered for 2 weeks prior. He set the sack on the porch and rubbed the back of his neck. They're bringing in a new sheriff, he said. From Fort Keogh. Vela straightened, her fingers still tangled in twine. Why? Old one took ill. They want someone with army ties. Seems the town's worried about growing fast and lawless. She brushed dirt from her apron. You think it'll reach this far out? Hard to say. But folk talk more when soldiers come through. Strangers listen harder. Vela nodded once, then turned back to her braiding. You think anyone asked after us? I didn't give them reason. She looped the twine and set the onions on a shelf carved into the slope. That may not matter if someone remembers my face. Quentin stepped closer, his boots crunching over dry grass. If it comes to it, I'll speak. They'd take my word over any drifter's tale. I don't want you to lie for me. I won't, Vela, but I'll protect what's mine. She looked over her shoulder. You mean the land? He reached for her wrist, gentle. I mean you. She swallowed, her throat working around the knot of unsaid things. There's a man still alive who knows what happened before I came west. He's cruel but clever, if word ever reached him. It won't. You can't know that. I can know you're not alone anymore, he said. And that I've got 50 acres between you and any man who'd mean you harm. She let her wrist rest in his hand a moment longer, then stepped back, quiet. That evening, Polly brought her a pressed flower he'd found by the creek. Petal had tied a blue ribbon in her hair and asked if she could wear it for supper. Quentin smoked meat over the fire pit behind the barn, the smell drifting across the yard with the promise of something steady. Later, as dusk settled and the meal was done, Vela handed him a folded scrap of paper. He looked at it puzzled. It's a list, she said. Things I know how to do, things I can teach. He opened it. The handwriting was small and slanted. Cider brewing, lye soap, sore throat poultice, buttonhole mending, seed saving, midwifery. You already do more than enough, he said. I want to earn my place, not just fill it. He folded the paper and tucked it into his pocket. You already have. She didn't answer, but she stood a little straighter as she gathered dishes. Quentin watched her, the lamplight catching the curve of her cheek, the way her hands moved with practiced grace. He thought of how little he'd asked for and how much he'd been given. Later, when the stars were thick above them, he found her out by the fence, looking north. "Something on your mind?" he asked. She didn't turn. "I was thinking of my mother. She died young but strong. I remember her saying once, a woman's place is where her hands are needed and her heart's allowed to rest." He came to stand beside her, resting his arms on the rail. "You think she'd approve of this place?" Vela's voice was soft. "I think she'd say I finally found what I was owed." Quentin didn't speak for a long while. Then, without looking at her, he said, "There's a preacher who rides out from Miles City once a month. Stays with the Rankins 2 hills over." She turned her head. "You're thinking of speaking vows." "I'm thinking of keeping what we've built from being questioned. Not for the law, for us." A hush stretched between them, filled only by the distant sound of frogs in the creek. Vela's voice was sure when it came. "Then let's have him. I've no need for a dress or a gathering, but I'd like to be your wife proper." Quentin reached for her hand under the fence rail, his fingers warm against hers. "You already are," he said. "But I'll say it for the world to hear." She leaned into his shoulder, and they stayed like that until the cold rose up from the grass and the stars wheeled westward overhead. Nothing more needed saying. The rest would come in time, one quiet day after another. The preacher arrived the first Sunday of September, just after the morning chill had lifted, his gelding damp with sweat from the ride. He was lean and wind-worn, with a quiet tone and a coat patched at the elbows. Quentin met him at the edge of the pasture, offered water and a seat in the shade, and explained what they needed without embellishment. Vela stood at the cabin door, smoothing the front of her blue cotton dress. It was the only garment she owned that hadn't been mended in 3 places, and she'd washed it in the creek the evening before with quiet care. Her hair was braided and pinned, and she'd tucked a single prairie rose behind her ear petals doing. The girl had insisted. Polly and Petal sat on the porch steps, hushed and wide-eyed, both scrubbed pink from their morning wash. Petal held the family Bible Vela had carried from Kansas, the cover worn soft as leather from years of use. They stood beneath the cottonwood near the corral, where the shadows fell long on the grass, and the air smelled of sweet clover. Quentin shifted, his hands rough and steady at his sides, and when the preacher asked, "By what names shall I speak your bond?" he answered without pause. Quentin Vaughn and Vela Lorne joined as one. The words were simple, no fanfare, no crowd, but they held. When Vela placed her hand in Quentin's, her fingers didn't tremble. She spoke her vows with clear voice, looking into the eyes of the man who had offered her land, a name, and a future without asking for anything but truth. Afterward, the preacher took his supper with them, beans and boiled greens, and cornbread still warm from the pan, then rode back north before the light faded. The children fell asleep on the floor near the hearth, curled against each other like pups in a den. Vela stepped outside to where Quentin was splitting kindling by lantern light. His shirt sleeves were rolled and the sweat on his brow had dried to salt. She touched his arm. "I want to build more than a home," she said. "I want to build a life worth handing down." Quentin set aside the axe and turned. "Then we'll build it together." She leaned into him, her cheek against his chest. "You've never asked what I ran from. I never needed to. But I want you to know. There was a man in Kansas, a neighbor. He thought grief made me weak. He tried to take what wasn't his, and when I fought back, he made sure I couldn't stay. Told lies, turned folks against me." She stepped back to look up at him. "That's why I came west. Not just to survive, but to live where no one could twist my story." Quentin cupped her face with both hands, his thumbs brushing the edge of her jaw. "Your story's yours now, and it's safe here." She kissed him then, not tentative, not unsure. She kissed him like a woman who had decided that love was not something to be feared, but chosen. They lay that night side by side in the bed Quentin had built himself. The walls quiet, the world hushed around them. Wind rustled the eaves and the fire burned low, and for the first time in years, Vela slept without waking. By mid-October, Paulie had begun his lessons with Mrs. Elwell, riding into town twice a week with Quentin. He carried a small slate board and a pencil stub, and came home every evening with new letters scratched in careful rows. Petal took to watching the chickens, learning their rhythms, and had begun naming them after wildflowers. Vela planted garlic in the back garden, knowing it would sleep through winter and rise strong come spring. She stitched curtains from old flour sacks, embroidered with vines and stars. Quentin built a smokehouse by the barn, teaching Paulie how to hang the meat and keep the fire low. One morning near the end of the year, snow fell in slow, heavy flakes, covering the land in white. Quentin woke to the smell of coffee, his wife standing over the stove with a shawl around her shoulders and a small smile on her face. She turned to him. "I've never seen snowfall like this." He pulled on his boots, crossed the room, and kissed her forehead. "It'll keep us close for a while." She handed him a cup and said, "Good, I like close." The snow stayed for days. They passed the time reading aloud, mending harnesses, and teaching Petal to bake. Paulie built a sled from scrap wood, and Vela taught him how to wax the runners with lard. At night, they played dominoes by lantern light, and Quentin carved a small wooden horse for Petal, sanding it smooth with care. When spring returned, the land softened and green returned to the fields. The garlic broke through the soil. The hens laid daily. The Vaughans, because that's what all four of them were now, gathered seeds to plant a second garden, wider than the first. One evening, Quentin and Vela walked the edge of the pasture, watching the sky bloom orange and purple. She slipped her hand into his. "You ever think you'd have this?" she asked. "No," he said, "but I hoped." She stopped walking, turned to him fully. "You gave me more than shelter, you gave me ground to grow in." He touched her cheek, his voice low. "And you gave me a reason to stay soft where it mattered." She kissed him once, then again, and they stood there as the stars came out, the wind warm and full of promise. They never left that land. Through drought, through snow, through seasons that came hard and those that came easy, they stayed. Together, they raised Petal and Paulie with steady hands and open hearts. More children came in time, each one named for something that had endured. They built additions to the cabin, planted orchards, taught reading and writing by the hearth. And always, at the end of each day, when the work was done and the sky turned dark, Vela would rest her head on Quentin's shoulder and he would hold her close, both of them knowing that what they'd made wasn't just a life, it was a home. One they'd earned. One they'd never have to leave.